happy that they are here with us. If you're not familiar with Arch, please do go to their website. We'll put the URL in later. They are in the midst of developing a heritage center and need all of the help and cold hard cash that they can get. So do keep them in mind as you plan your giving for the future year. And I guess that's everything that I have to say. Oh, something else to keep in mind, so I don't mention it later. The Frederick Historic Sites Consortium is trying to do more virtual programming this year. And we do have on June 26th, we will have Michael Twitty be with us virtually. We're not quite sure what that's going to involve yet. For those of you who don't know Michael, he is an African-American foodways historian from our area here. He has done lots of things in Frederick in real life previously. Before he became very famous with his book, The Cooking Gene. He also has just published his more recent book called Rice. So we're delighted. We're more delighted that Phillip is with us tonight, but we're delighted that Michael will be with us in June. So keep that in mind and keep an idea, keep a look at our website and our Facebook page, and we will let everyone know that, those of you who are on our mailing list. Anyway, thank you again so much for coming out tonight. I'm delighted to have Phillip Nicholas with us tonight. Full disclosure, Phillip is a grad student who is doing an independent study with me this semester. And I have learned so much from talking to Phillip weekly throughout the semester about his genealogy. And it's been more than fascinating. It's been beyond interesting. And I'm delighted that he's able to be with us tonight. As you may already know, the title of Phillip's talk is going to be Researching Your Jamaican Ancestors and the Complex Story of Slavery. So we're just going to jump right in, and we will let Phillip come onto the, well, he's already onto the screen. As you can see, he also has very nice digs there. You know, good library school students do much better these days than in my. So Phillip, go ahead and take it away and share your screen, and I will be keeping track of the chat. And we will be taking questions at the end. So thank you, Phillip. And again, thank you everyone for coming out. This means an awful lot, both to me and Phillip. So thank you.
All right. Can everybody see my screen?
We can. Thank you. It looks good.
All right. All right. Good evening, everyone. My name is Phillip Nicholas, and I am a genealogist and also a part-time MLIS student in my second year here at the University of Maryland, College Park. And I've been into genealogy / family history since I was young and have been doing this for approximately about 12 years. I am also of Jamaican descent, which explains my interest in Jamaican genealogy. My mother was born in Jamaica. My father was born in the UK, but to Jamaican parents. And today I will be conducting a presentation on researching your Jamaican ancestors and the complex story of slavery. All right, so getting started. So first I want to say that, yes, these are some basic to-dos before researching your ancestors for any genealogy, but I would say these processes are vital steps also for researching your ancestors in Jamaica. So the first thing you do want to do is interview your relatives, starting with parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, and cousins. And then next you want to start taking notes, but you also want to remember to consider the unexpected and any other possibilities when listening to family lores, because of course, sometimes some of those stories might not be true, but although there are some times where there are some truths to them. And then from there, you want to start creating your family diagrams, starting with you and then branching up to your parents and then to your grandparents and then moving outwards to your aunts, uncles, and then back down to your cousins. Lastly, you want to start looking, searching some immigration records, and you can find immigration records on ancestry.com and Find My Past. And you want to look at these immigration records because sometimes they will list the birth dates for your ancestors, or their place of origins in the islands. So that will be very key when doing your research. Next, you want to familiarize yourself with some of the terminologies and vocabulary that you will come up while conducting your research, starting off with like mulatto, quadroon, mestiz, sambos. So these were some identifications for people who were usually of mixed African and European descent. Also, you might come across the terms brown or people of color. Again, these were also some identifiers for people of mixed ancestry and sometimes could be referred to an Indian person. Then there was the term coolie, which would be also referred to Indian people who were indentured and contract laborers that came in the 19th century to supplant the work that was done by the former slaves. Another terminology you want to be familiar with is Coromantee, which was a person from the Gold Coast, which is present day Ghana and the Ivory Coast, and it could also possibly be Benin. Another term you want to know is Creole. Now, this term can mean different things in different locations, but for Jamaica, it's usually a person or an inhabitant that was born on the island. Another term you might come across is dissenter. So that would be an affiliation with the Protestant church, but they weren't associated with the state church, which was the Anglican church. And then another term would be Igbo, which would be a person that was from the Bida Biafra, which was present day Nigeria and Cameroon, and usually referred to the Igbo. And then lastly, the Maroon, who were people or persons of descent of the fugitive slaves who ran away and established their own communities, and they lived in these isolated and free communities. Next, you want to know the population. So out of many, one people, that's Jamaica's motto. And over the period of indigenous settlement, Spanish and English colonization, and then later British colonialism, there have been different groups who have settled, lived in, or called Jamaica home. Here are some of the groups. So West Africans, they came to Jamaica forcefully as enslaved people, primarily from Ghana, the Ivory Coast, Nigeria, Cameroon, Congo, Angola, but not exclusively to those locations. You also had your Europeans, mostly from the British Isles, coming from England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. And they start arriving right after the English colonized the island. Then you had your French, who largely came right after, during the period of the Haitian Revolution and afterwards. And then Germans who came during the mid-19th century, and they were coming after slavery was abolished, and also to sometimes, in some instances, supplant the labor that the former slaves had done. And also there was an initiative to build up the white population, which obviously didn't work. Then you had your South Asians who are coming from India, mostly Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, Adwa, and the southern regions. You also had your East Asians, the Chinese who were mostly coming from Guangdong in Hong Kong. And you had your Middle Eastern people, the Lebanese who were coming in the 19th century mostly as merchants. And there was also Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews who also came to Jamaica. The Sephardic Jews now had been in Jamaica before the English. They came after Columbus had settled on the island, and usually was to escape the Spanish, or at this time, I think it was the Portuguese Inquisition. And then of course you had your native and indigenous people, the Arawak and the Taino people, who were the original inhabitants. And then also there were some indigenous people coming from the Mosquito territories, which is in present day Honduras and Belize. Next, you want to know the different parishes. There were 14 current parishes and 3 current counties. Now, the concept of a parish is kind of similar to a state in the United States. That's something to think of. It is important to understand while conducting your family history that there were many parishes before, and some of the towns were part of a different parish. For example, you could have family that was from the parish of Manchester. But when you're researching your ancestors in 1811, you'll realize that parish didn't exist. So it's perhaps that your ancestors may have been living in either St. Elizabeth, Clarendon, or Vere. And these were the parishes that later some parts had given up to form Manchester. So overall, these parish borders were not fixed until 1866. And then, as I've been briefly alluding to, you definitely want to understand the historical context. Like with all genealogy, it's definitely important to understand this context with Jamaica. For instance, it is important to know when certain groups were migrating to Jamaica, and when events were occurring on the island that may have affected your ancestor. One major point to keep in mind is to remember when slavery was abolished, which was in 1834, and the end of the apprenticeship period, which was in 1838. And the apprenticeship period was a transition period from being an enslaved person to a freed person. And also the British government at this time was compensating the former slave owners for their enslaved property. So therefore, it is important when researching your ancestors to know what records will be more specific to you. Now, what's available? So luckily for those researching their ancestors in Jamaica, there's many readily available resources online. The most primary source that will be most relevant to you is Family Search, which I've included the URL. There's no subscription fee. All you have to do is just create a username and password. And the highlighted collections that I have, those are going to be the ones that are most relevant for you. So the Jamaican Civil Registration and the Jamaican Church of England Parish Registers. As you can see, for the birth registers, marriage registers, and death registers, the years end at certain periods. Now, there are records that go past those periods, but however, the Mormons had only digitized up to those periods. So that's something also to consider. And then you'll also have access to the wills, some wills that are from 1756 to 1930. And unfortunately, those wills have been digitized, but they haven't been transcribed yet. However, you can go to JamaicanFamilySearch.com, which does have indexes, and you'll be able to utilize that to augment your research. Also on JamaicanFamilySearch.com, you will have access to almanacs, deeds, grants, more church records, and also plenty other more records, journals, and diaries. Now for Ancestry.com, what would be most pertinent for using that would be the former British colonial dependency slave registers from 1813 to 1834. Now, what that was, well, after 1807, when the slave trade was abolished, the British colonies attempted to combat illicit transportation of slaves coming from Africa to their British colonial colonies. So what they did was they kept a register of all their slaves who they considered that were lawfully enslaved. So registration began, and it usually occurred every 3 years, but it was once a year. And so for Jamaica, you'll see registers for 1817, 1820, 1823, 1826, 1829, and 1832. All right. Here are some images that you want to familiarize yourself. These are two images, one for a birth record and a baptismal record. For the birth record, as you can see, it lists the birth date of the child that was born, also the location. For this birth record, a name was not listed for the child, but there on other birth records, children's names were listed. For this one, it's probably because at the time of registration, the parents didn't have a name in mind. Then you also have your parents' names that are listed, the father's occupation, the informant, which in this case, it was the father, and the date it was registered. This information is also the same on the baptismal record. However, on the baptismal record, you also have the church clerk who had registered it. Here are some more images of for a marriage record and a death record. The marriage record has the names for the marrying parties, their marital status right before they got married, for this particular marriage, their occupation, their age, the parish and residency that they were living at before they got married, their father's names, and also the church or the location wherever they were married, including who were present at their marriage. Then at the bottom, you have a death record, which includes the date and place of death, the individual's name, their gender, their marital status, and age. Now, sometimes for married women in the field where it has rank, profession, and occupation, their husband's name would be listed and the husband's occupation, but not all the time, but it seems like some of the times the husband's name would be listed and their occupation. And then in the next column, you have their cause of death, and then after that, the informant. Now, there's much more research and records that are available. You can do those research on the island. You would have to go there to the Jamaican archives, or you could possibly request a genealogical research to be done on your family. However, it does take several weeks. But at the Jamaican archives, you'll get access to more records, legal, administrative, slave registers, which is also the same registers that are on ancestry.com, parish registers, you have plantation records, diaries, journals, maps, and much more. Also, you could go to the Register General's Department, which is also known as the Island Record Office. And there you will have your vital records, which is your births, marriage, and deaths. And these are going to be the ones that are after the years where it stops on family search. It'll also include the years before, but that will be most pertinent to you. And they also have wills for all the wills that were administered and improved on the island. Another location you might be interested in checking is the Roman Catholic Chancery, which is in Kingston, and it has their church records, their baptisms, marriages, and deaths. And again, another repository that you might be interested in checking out is the National Archives at Kew. And there you will have your slave registers, which again, they have all been digitized on Ancestry. And those records, you don't have to have a subscription. You could easily go on and check those. And also they have ship logs for indentured servitudes that were coming to the island. So once you have gathered all the information, now that you'll have a better understanding of what records and resources are available, and you'll be more ready to conduct your research. Now, one of the most challenging aspects of researching your family history in Jamaica is tracing your ancestors that were born out of wedlock. Now, this prime reason exists because of an old English law that stated if a child was born illegitimately or out of wedlock, that the father's name was not to be listed on the birth record. And most of the time the clerks did do that. Now, there are instances where I've seen where the clerk did also record both the parents' names on the birth record, although the parents were not married, but this is not always the case. Now, in the image that I have, I'm showing, this is an image of a birth record of my great-grandmother. And as you can see, her father's name is not listed. However, her father, who I found out from my grandmother, was James Morgan, and he is listed as the informant or the occupier, which was the occupier of the house that she was born in. So by being able to speak with my grandmother, I was able to find my great-grandmother's birth certificate and also the name of her mother. Now, the next problem I encountered when I was tracing this lineage of my family was locating the birth record of my great-great-grandmother, Louise Gale, because again, she was also born out of wedlock. So I turned to some different strategies. One strategy that I did was attempt to locate all the birth records for all the children that my great-great-grandmother had, Louise Gale. For this presentation, I only put up 2 images for a few of her children. She did have more. But what struck me was I kept seeing the same name appear as the informant on the other children's name, Emma Morgan. So that made me curious, and it made me think, I wonder if this person was related to her. So one of my next strategies was to locate all the birth records for the children that Emma Morgan had. And luckily I was able to find that Emma Morgan had a daughter named Evelyn Louise, born March 18, 1898 in Portland Cottage in Clarendon. And after consulting with my grandmother and other relatives, they did confirm that yes, Emma Morgan was Louise Gale's mother. And they also said they did know her, and they referred to her as Muma, which in Jamaican Patois means, usually it refers to a female parent. So that's what she was known as. Another strategy you could use is turning to DNA genealogy, which is something that's been on the rise. And when I did that, I did locate a DNA match for somebody who was the grandson of Jane Morgan. As you can see, Jane Morgan is listed as the informant on Louise Gale's birth record. So Jane Morgan was Emma Morgan's mother, or Emma Morgan's sister, excuse me. And I also realized that this DNA match was also matching everybody that I was connected to through Emma Morgan. So that also confirmed this connection. Another tool that you could use to augment your research is using a map. So it helps to kind of trace exactly where your ancestors were. And as you can see at the bottom, my family started out in Portland College and then moved up to Lioneltown, and then from Lioneltown to Salt River. And this is the area where they were living at. So there's different resources you can use to locate and trace your ancestors that were born out of wedlock, but these are just some of the tools that I use. Another major challenge is locating your enslaved ancestors in Jamaica. Now, this requires understanding also the historical context. Now, for another side of one of my other lineages that I was interested in was Heretta Shrimpton, who would have been my 4 times great grandmother. And I was able to find a death certificate for her in 1891. And on that death certificate, I saw that her age, she was 65 years old. So what I did was subtract that from the date of death and was able to discover that she was born approximately about 1826. So by understanding that historical context, you would realize, okay, so she's born before slavery. So there's a possibility that she was born enslaved. So what I could do was, there are some indicators that you could use to consider whether your ancestor was enslaved or not, which is you could base that off of the occupation or perhaps whether or not they could write. Now, these indicators are not really mutually exclusive, but it's a choice that you could use. The next thing you could do is locate a record that's closest to when slavery was abolished and the apprenticeship. I was able to find a baptismal record for Heretta Shrimpton, and it was in 1841. It shows her, at that time, she was 14 years old. So by subtracting that, I was able to approximate that she was born about 1827. That kind of links up with the age that's listed on her death certificate, and that she was living at Salt River. So for me, the next strategy was to locate a slave return for Heretta Shrimpton that's closest to Salt River. And luckily for me, I was able to find a slave return for Heretta Shrimpton. She's listed in the slave return as being a slave owned by William Godwell, who was a resident living at Salt River. As you can see, the highlighted portion is where her name is listed, and she's described as a Sambo. So in this case, that means she was about 75% Black, a quarter white. And then it lists her age, and by
approximating that based off of the time this return was taken, I can gather that she was born approximately about March 1827. So again, this is more linking information that's linking to the other records that I was able to find. And I was able to find out that she was the daughter of Marion Brown. So these are some of the resources that you could use to locate your enslaved ancestors in the slave returns, or you could simply just search by the parish, the estate, or the owner. Now, moving on to some of the more complex stories of slavery. Now, there's one thing to consider is that not every ancestor had a similar experience during slavery. In fact, some had a different experience that would not have necessarily been considered before. So I decided to move on to my Newell line for this. And what I did is first locate all the birth and baptismal records of the children of my 4 times great-grandfather, George Newell. And one record particularly stood out to me, which was the birth record of his daughter, Jane Newell. So on that record, I was able to find out, as it's in the highlighted portion, that George Newell's occupation is listed as a planter. And as you can see on the other highlighted portion, it says brown man. It's kind of hard to see, but that's listing his background. So that to me means mixed race ancestry. But what mostly stood out to me was, so this is a birth record for Jane Newell, and she was born in 1845. So that's not too far removed from slavery. But the father's occupation is a planter. So that is not something that you usually see. Most of the people that were formerly enslaved usually were laborers still after slavery was abolished. So the next thing I did was attempt to search for a baptismal record for George Newell. I found one, and he was baptized in 1813 in the parish of St. Dorothy, and he was approximately born about 1811. And he was a quadroon free son of Joseph Newell and Elizabeth Bonner. So what I was most curious to find out was, what was a free man of color doing during slavery? So one of the things I did was search for a will of Joseph Newell, which helped me link the prior information I was able to find to this document. And in this will, I kind of transcribed it because it is a little bit fuzzy. So it was approved in October 10th, 1817 in Jamaica. And in this will, Joseph, George's father, mentions his son, George Newell, and the mother of his child, Elizabeth Bonner, who was an enslaved woman, but at this time she was deceased, and she was formerly the property of a Francis and William Morgan of Clarendon. Now, what was getting most interesting to me that I wasn't expecting was that Joseph also bequested the remainder of his slaves to his son, and he had a William Jackson and Alexander Lumsden, which are also highlighted, be the guardianship of his son through this ownership at the beginning until he reached an adult age. So the next thing I did was, again, look at the slave returns, but this time I was looking at something different. So on the slave returns, the one image that you see on your left is a slave return for George Newell. And as you can see, there's an Alexander Lumsden who's listed as the guardian to George Newell. So here, sadly, it shows that George Newell had owned these enslaved people. And then on the image on your right, I found another slave return for George Newell at an adult age. And here he is selling an enslaved person. Now, for me, this definitely struck me. Learning that him as a free man of color who owned other people of African descent, that was definitely odd. I mean, I grew up in the US, so I was also very familiar with American history. But however, I was also aware that slavery was also a prime economic opportunity in Jamaica. So perhaps, although George did inherit these slaves from his father, he probably also considered the opportunity to make money for himself and possibly for a family. So here, this highlights the complexity of slavery and shows that what you may have thought about your ancestors, which was usually could have been based on their complexion or status, then it may be a different story than what you might have been expecting, or that may have transpired. So as I continued, I found another document. This is on the Legacy of British Slave Ownership website, which is another resource that you do want to use to augment with your research. It lists all the estates and slave ownership. But for this one, I saw that George Newell was compensated by the British government for his former enslaved property after the enslaved people were abolished, and he was compensated about 92 pounds. So again, this is more connecting documentation. Next, I turn to my direct paternal lineage on the Nicholas side. So now turning to another branch of my tree, I learned there are other opportunities to be learned from researching your ancestors in Jamaica. So I was able to trace my family lineage back to my 5 times great-grandparents, George Newell and Christina Hazel, who were both enslaved people living on the Elmwood Plantation in the parish at the time called St. Thomas in the East, but later eventually called Portland. And I found a slave marriage for them, which was on August 25th, 1822. And by looking at all the slave returns for the slave owner that had owned the Elmwood Plantation, I was able to find all the children that George and Christina had: Polly Nicholas, Lenora Nicholas, Industry Nicholas, James Nicholas, who was my 4 times great-grandfather, John Weber Nicholas, and Selena Nicholas. Now, the reason why I listed that is, so this is key for understanding naming practices, where the parents would usually name the children after other family members, usually close ones. So from here, I wanted to look for the entry in the slave return for George Nicholas. Now, an initial attempt, I couldn't find one, but then what shocked me, what interested me was I found an entry for a George Nicholas Patton, who here is listed color Negro, age 20, and Creole. And then he's the son of Polly Patton, who was formerly known as Industry. Now, after utilizing or using the naming patterns to kind of augment my research, and also the process of elimination of looking at all the slaves that were on that plantation, I was able to confer that this was my George Nicholas. So sometime after 1817, he dropped the surname Patton. So my next attempt was to locate a marriage record for his parents, who I found out was James Patton and Polly Patton, and they were both enslaved also on the Elmwood Plantation. So from there, my next turn was to look for an entry of them in the slave returns. And I did. So I found that James Patton, who was formerly known as September, was listed as Negro at the age of 52 and from Africa. Same thing with Polly Patton, formerly known as Industry, and was listed as Negro at the age of 40 and also African. So through the paper trail, I was able to locate some of my ancestors who had survived that transatlantic slave trade and were living in Jamaica. And then also through this paper trail, I've been able to identify 23 enslaved African ancestors, 17 on my paternal side and 5 on my maternal side. So from here, I was curious. I wanted to know more about this African connection. So the next step, which I knew that since I was a direct male descendant from this James Patton, through my fathers and his fathers in that line, that I was carrying his Y, so I am carrying his Y chromosome. So the next thing I did was turn to DNA. So I used I tested my DNA with 2 companies. I wanted to get 2 different perspectives. One was FamilyTreeDNA.com and African Ancestry. Now, this is where it got really interesting. On Family Tree DNA, the results came back and I saw that I was matching 1 person in Algeria, 4 people in Saudi Arabia, 2 in the United States, and then I had genetic distant matches with people in the Bahamas, Bermuda, Cameroon, Kuwait, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, the United States, and Yemen. So I looked at the matches for the United States and saw that they were both 2 African-American men. So that made sense to me. That's the connecting through that transatlantic slave trade. And same with the Bahamas and Bermuda. And then Cameroon and Nigeria that's that West African connection. So perhaps then my James patent came from the Bite of Biafra. Now, I was a little bit confused at first on where was the connection coming from Algeria, North Africa, and the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Yemen. So a next thing I did was I waited for my results for African ancestry, and it started to get a little bit more confusing. I saw that I was sharing genetic ancestry with people living in Portugal and Spain. So then it started to make sense. So for this, you have to really understand that historical context and the historical context of Africa. So I knew a little bit of history about the Iberian Peninsula, that they had been conquered and under the occupation of the historical Moors, who were the Arabs and Berbers, so the Arabs during this Islamic expansion as they were coming westward across North Africa and then into the Iberian Peninsula, that they settled there, which makes sense in that they also had relations with some of these West African groups in the Senegalese Valley area and the lower southern region of Mauritania. And from there, a group that emerged known as the Fulani, who carried both their genetic tracing markers and also these West African tracing markers. And the Fulani people were nomadic people and lived in many West African countries, and they expanded eastward as they were also spreading Islam. Now, at the end of the 18th century, more so going into the beginning of the 19th century, they had started a jihad, and not all the time they won these wars. So if they lost, they were captured, and like the rest of the other West African groups, they were sold at the coast to a European slave trader. So that started to explain more of why I was matching some of these, the reason why I was possibly matching some of these Arab and Berber matches. Now, for future reference, I do plan to look at some more plantation records and also to take the Y-DNA, I think 700, to get a little bit more information. All right, so I want to say, so when doing your Jamaican genealogy, you definitely, some keys to doing a successful research is make sure you consult experts, join genealogy discussion boards, because you never know, there could be somebody also tracing your same lineages. And then make sure to augment your research by utilizing all the available resources that are available to you. And then lastly, of course, make sure to take breaks. This could definitely be an addicting experience. So here I list my contact information. I'm definitely available for any consultation or genealogy research. And I definitely specialize in genealogy in Jamaica, Barbados, and also British genealogy. And at this time, I would like to give a special thank you to Professor Mary Mannix and the Frederick County Public Libraries for giving me this opportunity to share my research and being able to show a different perspective of conducting genealogy research. So that concludes my presentation. At this time, I can take questions.
Thank you so much, Philip. Okay, we do have some questions in the chat, and people feel free to put more questions in the chat. And Carrie Savidra, my lovely co-host, who's the other co-chair of the Historic Sites Consortium, will make sure I don't miss any of them, but I have a whole new strategy is that I photograph them as they come up. So I'm very excited that I've got that smart about it. But Phillip, just to start out,
Yes.
the slave return, some of the terms that, we've talked about over the semester are foreign to those of us who've only dealt with American genealogy.
So are you referring to those terminologies that I mentioned, like the mulatto? So which terms are you referring to?
Slave return. I'm sorry, slave return. What is a slave return?
Oh, the slave return.
The document type called slave return.
Oh, the slave returns. Okay,
Yes,
so
yes.
that's the British Colonial Dependency records, and it's for the slave registers. And so for that again, after the slave trade was abolished in 1807, the British colonies wanted to make sure they were tracing all the slaves because they wanted to combat this illegal trading that was going on. So they wanted to make sure that they have each of the owners actually have the slaves that they're supposed to have, and they had to constantly send these returns to the UK.
How frequently did they do them? Was it done on a regular basis?
Yes. So every 3 years, once that year. So if it was done in 1817, it was done once that year, and then the next 3 years.
Next 3 years. And how can you find them? Where are they located?
Yes, they are located on ancestry.com.
Okay.
And they are, so you don't have to have a subscription to look at them.
Oh, cool. Interesting. Good to know. And another question, we have a slew of questions that came in early on. What tools do you use for mapping locations related to your ancestors?
Yes. So for mapping locations, for the map that I did show you, I got that map from the Library of Congress. The Library of Congress actually does have a lot of maps pertaining to Jamaica, but there's also another tool called, I think it's like Fallen in the Grain. And it's a website, and it does have a digitized map of Jamaica, and you're able to pinpoint locations on there.
Cool. And I know more are coming up in the chat there. So very exciting. So and this one ended with #gold. So how in the world did you find a slave marriage document, which is something that we have gone on about all semester, about the records in Jamaica that simply don't exist in any form over here. So
yes. So actually, I got lucky and stumbled across these records when I was going individually through the registers for that parish, which was St. Thomas in the East. I found there was documentation on slave marriages. The interesting thing, which isn't really surprising, is those slave marriages were not indexed. So it seems like, I guess the clerk necessarily either didn't care or didn't want those to be found, but I was able to just stumble across them.
So cool. So then also, what strategies do you suggest to find plantation records?
Yes. So unfortunately, there isn't any digitized records where you could go online and go find them. The plantation records are at the Jamaican archives. So you would have to go there, and you can definitely consult one of the researchers there who can point you to the plantation records.
And this actually isn't one of the formal questions, but I'm going to throw it in there because I know you've been interacting a lot with the Jamaican archives in the last couple of months. So they are taking kind of distance research questions, right?
They are, yep. They're closed right now due to COVID. And I'm not sure exactly when they're going to open up, but yes, they are available for doing research.
Okay, cool. And how long has it taken you to put these conclusions into your family tree and finding James Patton?
Oh goodness. This I think I found this James Patton maybe a couple years ago. It probably took me it didn't take me too long, so maybe like within a month I was able to find him and then establish this connection that yes, this definitely has to be who I directly descend from.
And then that's also after, I mean, how many years of like research that got you to that point?
Exactly. I had to continue to trace to get back there. Yeah.
So enslaved were included in church records for birth, marriage, and death regularly, were they not?
So I want to say about after 1800, they were included in baptismal records and marriage records, not so much burial records. But yes, there was initiatives by the white planters to baptize the enslaved populations.
And those were generally Anglican, if I'm remembering correctly.
That is correct. They were generally Anglican, but also there were other, so the dissenter churches that were coming over from like the Moravians or the Methodists who were coming over, and they themselves too were also baptizing the slaves.
How are slave laws differ in Jamaica than in the US? And then this is a multi-part one, so think about that while I'm doing the rest of it, okay?
Okay.
How are the slave laws different in Jamaica than the US? Could the enslaved marry? Were the children born of a white planter or free man, and enslaved woman born free?
Okay.
So do you got all the pieces of that?
Yes, I think.
We can revisit if not, so.
Yes. So the slave laws were, for the most part, very similar to the United States. What determined your slave status, like across in the United States and also across the other Americas where slavery exists, was depending on the status of the mother. So if the mother was enslaved, then her children would be enslaved. So that's what determined whether or not you were enslaved. Now, as for the white fathers, what were the laws as far as like, did you say marrying?
Yeah, could slaves leave, whether, I guess, I'm trying to think of the best way to rephrase this. And maybe Alicia could also feel free to step in too, as I'm trying to interpret what you're saying. So that were slave marriages well, obviously they're recognized by the church. Were they recognized by the white society? Was it considered a legal marriage in some form?
So that is a tricky question. So yes, they were definitely recognized by the church. However, I did notice when looking at the slave returns that for, in particular, between the marriage of George Nicholas and Christina Hazel, that Christina was still going by her maiden name, and that sometimes the children their surnames weren't listed, but they were definitely part of, they were also definitely the children of George Nicholas, because there are baptismal records for them that has that surname.
And Philip, do you know, and I know your research may not encompass this, and also Jamaica's different, but do you get any feel from the various, from your research over the years, that because of this kind of religious sanctity of these marriages, that families were less likely to be broken up by enslavers in Jamaica than they would be here, where, you know, all bets were off, essentially?
To some extent, yes. There wasn't much of an effort to break up families, but I mean, it still definitely did occur. So I mean, it's not that much different from here in the United States.
Then are you in contact with your DNA cousins in the US and Africa?
Yes, in the US, I am in contact with. So I do have the African DNA matches. I found many on GEDmatch. I haven't been in contact with them though yet, but that's something definitely I need to get in contact with.
Okay. All right, then this one's long, so I'm going to read to it. Okay. A relative tells me, and this is from Melody, a relative tells me that my great-grandfather was a teacher in Barbados. His last name is Robinson, which is a common surname. My knowledge of him is living in Charleston, South Carolina, most likely, and I'm going to mispronounce this, I can't pronounce it, something Island, South Carolina. I'm really bad at words. I'm sorry, Melody. Are there specific records of school teachers and students in Barbados that you're aware of?
That I'm aware of. Yes, there are records. There are some kind of directories for schools and teachers and students in Barbados. Yes, they would definitely be at the archives in Barbados.
And I'll put Philip on the spot here, but at least for the rest of this semester where he's learning to become a genealogy librarian, I'm sure if you contact him, Melody, he'd also would be willing to poke around a little bit more, and because I'm put him on the spot here, but he loves doing this kind of thing, you know.
Yeah.
You know how those genealogists are. Okay, since most of you are probably genealogists. Okay, did you watch the PBS series, The Long Song, based on a novel by Andrea Levi? The series is set during the final days of slavery in 19th century Jamaica. Well, that's interesting. Do you know about this?
No, I don't know about this. That is interesting. But I think I definitely did hear about it, but I haven't seen it.
Okay. Well, now we have something
exactly.
We all need to go home now, and well, most
Yeah.
people probably all are home, but to be aware of and to take a look at. Okay,
Exactly.
let me see if I've if I've missed something, please step forward and feel free to unmute and ask. A lot of positive feedback too. Danita is putting emphasis on a strong understanding of historical perspective, which is something that I always push out too. So it is so, as Phillip has shown, it is so important to understand the history of the area that you can't work in isolation, but probably everybody here knows that.
Mary, I have a question.
Please step right up.
Phillip, I saw a special, I don't even know where it was, if it was C-SPAN or PBS or whatever, but have you heard of Professor David, and he has a Nigerian last name, Olusoga, and his work is to identify the planters who received reparations after slavery was ended in the English colonies in the West Indies. And all these graduate students in England have done this protracted study where they can also identify on a map where the descendants live based on the wealth. It's a fabulous study.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, no. You can Google him, and find out more about it.
Oh yeah, I would definitely do that. I never heard about this.
Yes, he's like a Dr. Gates.
Oh, okay.
But his specialty is connecting descendants who live in England or throughout the Isles, the British Isles, with the history in the British colonies, maybe not so much the United States, but the West Indies. And his spelling of his last name is Olusoga. David is the first name. And if you haven't heard of him, it's just a very interesting story. They have monetized how all these former owners of plantations are still billionaires based on the amount of money they received after slavery was abolished, and they were paid for their slaves. So it's how the wealth gap is still here and where all the money went, and primarily those people are located in England.
Oh yes, I am very familiar with that. Yeah, and actually some of those slave planters, like some that owned my family, had migrated to here in the United States in Connecticut, and some of their descendants also live still up actually in Connecticut and New England area, and they did also benefit from the compensation.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Alicia, if it's not a burden, because I didn't write it down well, could you put that gentleman's name in the chat?
Oh, yeah. Oh, certainly. Yes.
I appreciate
Okay.
that. And then Tom put in a link for Long Song. So thank you, Tom,
Oh,
Okay.
for doing that.
thank you, Tom.
Keeping us all together here. Oh, and look,
Yeah,
Tom's right on top of things. Never mind. Right on top of things. So that's fabulous. So much.
Oh, great. Okay, great. Thanks, Tom.
All right. Also, I've just put the link in for Arch, again, as one of our co-sponsors. I know we have some folks here who are not from around here. And even if you're not from around here, may I still strongly encourage you to take a look at Arch's Facebook page, their Facebook page as well as their website. As I said, they're in the midst of developing a heritage center, and they truly are transforming the landscape of Frederick County history. So please do take a look, and thank you. Tom said it too. I don't have to do anything. Tom's just doing it all. I'm just going to sit back. Thank you so much. But do keep do take a look at what Arch is doing, because it's phenomenal. And everyone, all of us in the community are so excited, all of us in the history community and the greater community, I do not doubt. But those of us in the history community are so excited to watch what's going on at Arch. So we're very thankful for that. And again, Carrie Savidra, whose camera is on now, is one of my my co-chair for the Historic Sites Consortium. Every February, the consortium has a local history conference. We did it on Zoom this year, and next year, even if we do it in real life, we're going to have a Zoom component of it. So please do also keep that in mind. We love to have people from other parts of the world. And we all know the more we learn about any type of history and any type of genealogy, it enriches what we do with our own research, our own families in our own areas. So that is so much. And yes, the recording will be available at some point, Tom. I want Tom in every audience. He's really good about asking the precise questions and also putting things in there. So I'm very happy about doing that. Does anybody else have any other questions? There's lots of love here in the chat. Philip, if you haven't seen it, I'll make sure you get that.
Okay, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, it's fabulous. And one of my patrons mentioned too, and something that we have talked about is what I consider to be almost a phenomenon, that the records in Jamaica are tracking enslaved people's first and last names. You know, if only we had more of that here in the States, it would be incredible. So anybody got anything else? What have I forgotten? Carrie, what have I forgotten?
I don't think you've forgotten anything other than folks, thank you for coming, and do keep a lookout for more posts from us on other programming that we're going to start doing here in the next few months.
Yes, and June 26th, Michael Twitty. So keep in touch with us if you're interested in that. You have Philip's contact information. I can be reached, probably the quickest way is mkmannix@gmail.com, because the county's email is this long involved thing. And I can forward any questions you may have to Carrie if you want to do anything directly to her. And of course, I'm also another way to get to Philip. And I feel like there's something else that I have missed here in the chat. Will I go back through and take a look? And I can't see right now what that was. Oh, I found it. Okay. So again, thank you everyone so much for coming out. We appreciate it so much. The consortium appreciates it, Arch appreciates it, and Philip and I particularly appreciate it. And again, if you have particular questions for Philip, really this is the time while he's still in his genealogy librarianship class to ask him, because we can force him to do research in a way that hopefully in the near future he'll end up charging for. So do take advantage of this time. And gosh, I keep thinking I'm missing something, but I